So perhaps you've been thinking of starting to watercolor and you wondered, where do I start? I have a good plan for you. After I planned out my first watercolor class, I realized I had done it in perfect order, just like the days of creation. Day 1, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Day 2, he separated the waters. Above was the sky, and a space below was the water. So we start by painting the sky, then we skip a space over here for the sailboats, and down here we'll paint the ocean. Day 3, he made dry land. Here we learn to mix greens and paint a little hillside. It is as easy as day 1, 2, 3. So let's get started. Hi, this is Fran with Stampendous, and we're ready to start our watercolor class 101. We're actually going to paint these 8 little vignettes in this class, and just to let you know, I would do these in about 30 minutes if I weren't giving instructions. But this way you'll be able to see right up close how we do it, and I'll give you lots of tips along the way. I will introduce just briefly here the different products that we'll be using. This is my Canson watercolor paper, 140-pound cold press, and I'm using the Daniel Smith Watercolor Essentials set of 6 tube paints, which I've already put into my folding palette, as you can see here. And I'm using these other things in this brush as well. I've covered an explanation of each of these different art materials in earlier countdown videos, and so I'm only going to very briefly mention them here, and you can go back and look at them to get a better understanding. So I showed you how my favorite color wheel starts out looking like this with the Daniel Smith paints, just these 6 colors, and when you take a wet brush to it, wonderful, you get all of these amazing transparent watercolors. I'm using this special folding palette, and when you purchase it from us, you will get this diagram that gives you the layout of all the colors and will help you identify the names. And we're just going to jump in on that today, but you can go back and watch that countdown video if it's helpful. Also, the brush that I'm using is a Snap Round number 10 watercolor brush, and we walked through these little practices with the brush just to help you see how versatile it is. And I will explain some of the other things as we get started. I've designed some particular polymer clear stamp sets for the purpose of teaching this watercolor series. These are the first 3, and the indexes on them were all done from my little watercolors, and this will be exactly what we're doing today in our little projects. I determined that this series would be done entirely with our clear polymer stamps. They're an incredible quality. They simply peel off of the backing, and you want to place them on a clear acrylic block larger than the entire piece. And in case some of you aren't familiar, I'm going to be using exclusively the VersaFine black ink, which is ideal for watercolor. You could also use Claire or Memento in a black if that was helpful. But this works great. This brand lasts so long and doesn't need re-inking. I'll mention here that if you're just getting started in stamping, you could see how, because the ink pad was raised, I was able to do a larger stamp by tapping it and moving it across the block. You want to keep things clean, so if you get excess ink, wipe it off, keep it off the paper and your hands. Press firmly, and you've got an impression that needs just a little bit of time to dry, and you'll be able to proceed with your watercolors. The fact that we are using the clear polymer allows you to see and place and combine different images from the scenic set and create a horizon line or whatever by being able to mix and match your placement of the stamps. The first watercolor that we're going to do is what I call free flow wet on wet technique. I wanted to share the inspiration that I had for this technique, and this is a little original painting that I purchased in Italy by an artist named Sandra, and I loved the dramatic sky that she created, and so that's what we're going to do first. I'm going to show you how to do that. It's a rather spontaneous thing, and I like to call it a free flow. It's a wet on wet technique. Each time you do it, it comes out different. I'm going to let these sit here as so that you can see as I'm working on it, where we're headed. I quite often need to have handy a blotter and sometimes a little scrap of paper that I can test how much paint I have on my brush. And here I have my water that we went through in an earlier countdown. This area of the large water is going to be my swamp area. The cleaner water in here I'll refer to as my well water. And as needed, I will take my little needle tip applicator and apply water into these little compartments here so that I can get plenty of color and pigment from the little pocket where the colors are. And in front I create a little puddle that allows me to use a bit of lighter shade of that color. The color that I'm using for the sky is this outside blue, which is French ultramarine, and I will often refer to it as marine. The first step that I need to do is to completely clean and test my brush so that I can simply apply a flood, we'll say, of clean, clear water. I'm creating a little sort of a square area up over the top of my little sailboats, and while it's still quite wet, I'm going to take my brush into that pure marine color, test that I have a really intense bit of paint on my brush, and then I'm simply going to touch it into that wet area. Look at that. It's allowing the water to do its work and creating a very interesting little cloud with very little effort. I might simply touch my brush a little bit more to the outer edge, and then I want to let it come a little bit further down. I have a very intense amount of paint on my brush, so I'm going to wash it out in my swamp, or I could have gone back into my puddle. I'm going to test that I have less paint on the brush, and then I'm going to carefully allow some of the water and paint to move a little bit further down. Maybe I'll let my brush let the clouds kind of dance in just a little bit, but I'm doing very minimal work here and mostly letting the water kind of do a free flow flood here. And this is definitely a wet on wet technique, but it's a variation of it that can be very dynamic and very fun. And you can see each time I did it, I got a different result. But this is the easy way to do a very dramatic sky. So this is something you might just need to try a couple of times. And for some of you, if you learn by visual, I made this little diagram. Be sure there's 3 steps to it. The first one, if you don't start with some enough clear water, it can't move. The color can't move. The second one, I barely touched my brush into that wet area with some pure marine blue. And then I let just a little bit of it, I pulled down on the sides. And in this case, I didn't need to do this third step very much. But if you had a hard line of blue all the way down here, I didn't get the sailboats wet, and I allowed that area to stay lighter. But if you had a hard line, then you could push some of that water up to diminish and soften that bottom edge. I'm going to do a quick demonstration of that where we did with the brush, and this time I'm going to do it with a much darker puddle here of the marine blue. Actually, let's push our luck a little bit further. So let's say I had a whole bunch of dark blue and I had a pretty hard line edge all the way around. Notice I'm cleaning off my brush in the swamp, I'm blotting it, and quickly I'm moving from below that hard edge and I'm pushing up. So take your brush and just practice this. See if you can totally eliminate that hard edge at the bottom. So it's drier and cleaner each time I come back with my brush. And that should dry with a soft edge and the harder edge at the top. So this will just be a wet on wet technique that you can practice and try getting your free flow technique going there to make a dramatic sky. And with even darker blue, look how dramatic that sky is. Next I'm going to do a combination of the sailboat stamps, and you may try it with or without the seagulls in the sky. I'm going to do one without because that is easier, and I'm now going to move from working with the marine blue. With the rest of what I'm going to do, I'm moving over to the inside blue, which is the phthalo blue. It's a very intense color, and I'm going to make sure my puddle that had dried earlier, I squirted some water in here ahead, and we'll make sure that that now gives us a nice kind of a medium blue. Okay, so you don't always want that dark of a sky, and I've got quite a bit of water in my brush. Since I've got a dark color, I'm going to go ahead and get my brush a little bit wetter and test what it's doing. So there's quite a bit of water on my brush with some paint, and now I'm going to practice doing a lighter sky in much the same way. I'm making broad, big strokes, and I want to define perhaps some clouds along the horizon. And depending on how wet and how much paint you have, you'll get all different results here of your sky. And you'll notice I came up around the sail of my boat here. And this is where, when the colors are damp, the more I play with it, especially when it's damp, the more muddled it may get. So I try to do it kind of in one pass that's quite wet and let it just dry and see what it does as it dries further. That little bit of white in there looks like a little moon there, so I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to say something real quick here about puffy clouds. We're thinking of the negative space in this case, where the white is the cloud area. So you could think of doing even scallops as a way to create the shapes that would look like a cloud, but make it uneven, and then you're actually painting the blue area, and the negative space is the white that you leave behind. And if you do that on both sides, you could create very puffy little clouds. We'll be practicing some more of this later. Next, I want to use my free flow technique to create the ocean. And so in this one, I'm going to go back to getting some clean, test my brush here, it's very light, some clean, very wet water here. And I'm just running my brush all the way across that horizon line. I'm going to quickly dip into my phthalo blue, see how strong a paint I have on my brush, because I want very intense color now. And now I'm simply going to flood it all the way across and let the water kind of move it around. You can tip the paper, let the water run a little bit, and if it's creating an irregular shape, you might drag your brush and pull it back across. And sometimes, again, the white that's left, that negative space, makes it very interesting. So each time you will see a different pattern with that much water. It just sort of takes over and does its own interesting thing. Watch it as it dries. It will lighten a little bit and you'll get interesting watermarks. But since we're doing an ocean, it's a great opportunity to do that free flow wet on wet technique. If I want to paint some more into the boats, I'll be sure and wait until all the blues have dried. So we're going to set this aside for now. And I'll mention as well that if you keep a light sky, you could come back and stamp your seagulls on top at a later time. But wait for the sky to dry. Next, I'm going to do a very simple little hillside where I've stamped only the fence. And before I start painting the sky, I want to get my greens ready. So the purpose of this palette is that I've set up the colors in order of rainbow order here, and I have extra pockets here. The pure colors are by themselves, but then additionally I've applied yellow in both of these compartments, and I've put extra of each of these blues in the compartments right here. Now I have made a space down here in the front area of my palette, and I'm going to squirt some more water, and this will always revive the paint that has dried there previously. And I'm going to get several of these colors all ready before I start. So I'm going to clean my brush and see that it's clean to start with. And I'm going to take my brush into this compartment. This has the Hansa yellow light and the phthalo blue. It's a very strong blue, so I will touch less on the blue and work my brush to the back to get more of the yellow on my brush, and then bring it down here into this little puddle. And you can see that that made a very nice medium green. I'm going to sort of blot off my brush. I want to create a lighter green. I just get even more of the yellow, and I can perhaps do a little bit of that here at the top. Okay, so that's some light green. You can see I can get all different values from either of these greens. And now, since I'm going to a darker green, I'm not going to worry about cleaning my brush so much, but I'm going to go into this pocket with yellow and the marine blue, mix it up in there, bring it forward into this little puddle. And now this gives me a different shade of green that's more of an olivey color. And again, I could have very light or much darker values of that same color by how much yellow and how much blue I had. This now gives me a place to have each of these puddles of green readily available, and I know exactly how I got them by what pocket I went into and where I've created the puddles. Okay? So now that I have those ready, I'm going to clean my brush in the swamp. I can check it on my blotter because I'm going to go back to the sky. I don't want any green in the sky. Okay, I go into my well water, which is handy to keep clean so that when I need clean water, it's there. And this time I'm going to start in my puddle of phthalo, and it's pretty intense color. I can test it here to see. And I'm going to do a little cloud area. And let's say I flood that much color into it. And then I stop short of the fence line. And then here I might decide I don't like the shape of these clouds. It's like the scallop going the wrong way. Then I use my mop-up technique, which is easier the lighter the color of blue is. And I'm blotting moisture and paint off of my brush. And then I can also try lifting some color with my brush as well. If it's rather dry and the paint is still damp, I can shape some additional little clouds. Okay, So now we'll let that dry. And since I've left an area of white above the fence, it's safe to go ahead and try my hillside here with my newly mixed greens. So I'm starting with my lighter green, and I'm just going to do a brush stroke that kind of comes across the fence but doesn't touch the sky. And I'm going to bring it down to the foreground, and since that's looking kind of pale, I'm going to go into my darker color, and since this is pretty wet, it's going to move around and sort of with a mind of its own probably, but our colors in the distance will look more faded and in the foreground will be more vivid. So we will let that dry and see how it looks after it dries. Again, with a rather hard line, that's probably going to dry more pronounced. I might take my brush and with a little bit less water and virtually no paint, I've softened that line like I did in the sky working upwards. Okay, so we're going to set that aside to dry. And in case I forget to come back to it, here you can see a hillside using more of the olive colors. And after it's completely dry in this area, I was able to take some darker paint on the very tip of my brush and simply do a little short line coming off of each fence post. Okay? If you do it while it's still damp, it's going to just all run together. But with the more pronounced little shadows, it looks like the sun came out. Next, I'm going to do a wider horizon, still keeping it pretty simple because I'm using only these two little stamps. I made them separate, and you can combine them to create a horizon line all the way across and keep adding them if you like. We'll start again with the sky, and this just gives you another opportunity to practice your techniques here with creating little puffy clouds. So think of that inverted sort of scallop idea here and see if you can create some clouds. And again, those are pretty strange looking clouds because they have such a hard line to them. So now I'm going to come back with the mop-up technique and soften it in some places and leaving it more hard edge in others. And the less you do with it, sometimes the more interesting it is. If I keep going back in and painting more with darker paint right now, as it starts to dry, all of your little brush strokes become very obvious. But if I do it while it's still wet, I may be able to darken that upper edge without creating too many funny things in the sky. So experiment with it, play with it a little bit, and see if you can create a unique skyline each time. That mop-up technique, I can push some of the water in the paint up to soften the edges. And you might just leave it like that. I think I will for now because we're going to move on to doing the hillsides. And I've intentionally gone to white, negative space, before I get to the hillsides so that I can now come in. This time I'm using the olive color. I've got quite a bit of it on my brush, and I'm simply doing quick, broad strokes here all the way across. And the shape of your brush strokes down here should sort of balance out with what you did in the sky. And perhaps I can add a bit of a darker green down here at the bottom. And again, it's still pretty wet, so it should blend together. And if it doesn't, it should hopefully give me the texture of some grass here in the foreground. I'm almost just using, maybe I'll use little vertical brush strokes, and that may look like some grassy fields. Maybe I'll add a little bit more color over here to the side. And you don't have to be that precise to the placement of the stamped lines. You're still going to get an interesting effect. Okay, so now we're going to let that dry. And as it dries, it often creates different patterns depending on how much water was in your application. The next thing we're going to do is a value study. I'm going to go back to using only the marine blue, and you can see here I stamped the balloons just to practice some different shades of color. And this way, just doing 5 steps will allow you to see what it takes to get a really intense color, and then how to step it down to lighter and lighter values. So this little design is a perfect one to do all in the French ultramarine blue. The hydrangeas and the little china pot are going to look just very interesting in this what looks like a Delft blue. So to start with, I've got, I'm going to replenish some water here to my little puddle. And add a little bit more color to it, to where maybe it's about a medium value. Let's say I refer to it maybe as a 3. And I have quite a lot of water on my brush. I can try to get some of it off back into the puddle. But now I want some very intense ultramarine blue, this outside blue. So I'm going to load up my brush with a rather intense shade of blue, because I want to get that 5 value blue. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to start with the leaves, and this is very intense. Notice how I'm making very quick brush strokes. I don't even have to exactly follow the lines. It looks more hand done to simply come up around all of these different, I might touch it up right there. Okay, this is going to dry a little bit lighter than that. I can start to see some of the paint moving around a little bit. And if anything, I might want a darker bit up under the edge of these flowers. That all is looking nice, rich blue color. Okay, so now I have an intense amount of paint still on my brush, so I'm going to tone it down just a little bit, check what's happening, and that kind of toned it down too much. I'm going to go back into my pocket. And now I want to, using just the tip of my brush without it being too wet, I'm going to come in and paint the pattern on the vase. One little brush stroke should be all you need for each little leaf. And I have a light touch. I'm just using the tip of my brush. Okay? If you want, you could paint this little pattern across there. Okay, I'm going to work from my darkest values and keep stepping it back. So to do that, I can add a bit more water, and let's say this would be the next darkest area. And again, if it's too wet and it puddles up too much, it takes longer to dry, and then the color is most likely to leave some watermarks. So I'm sort of just lifting away some of the moisture from that area. And then I'm going to test to see that I have a much lighter shade, maybe a 3 or a 2 value on my brush. And I'm going to now come in and almost do a crescent shape of blue. And by doing that, it's going to make this entire cluster of blossoms look more three-dimensional. And I'm going to assume that my light is coming from this direction, and so the shadows would be to the far side of that, and the petals that are in behind will be shadowed more than the ones that are facing the light. So in the same way, I haven't put any more paint on my brush. I'm just moving around and doing the petals that are behind, and it's pushing them back and bringing other bits to the foreground. This one will look strange if it's entirely white, so you might add just a little bit at the center. So already we've created a beautiful effect of quite a bit of contrast. And next I'm going to do this little shadow, and for that I want a 2 to a 3 value so that it shows up and looks intentional. So I'm going to turn my piece. I'm going to start at the point of the vase and simply see if I can do it in one stroke. And since that was a little bit light, I'm going to come back within that same shape and create a little shadow and just kind of lift to the side. We've now anchored our vase to the table instead of floating in midair. And I carefully tipped the paper. Now I'm tipping it up so that the shadow will be even darker right underneath the vase. And this again assumes that the light is coming in from this side and casting a shadow to the left. I think because I'm right-handed, I tend to do most of my lighting from that angle. Now if I want to add a little bit more interest to this, I can come back in with a little bit more paint, maybe a 3 or a 4 here. And I might darken under here just a little bit more. Maybe blot a little bit of that off. And again, this area behind would be a little bit darker. You don't want to overdo it, but just a barely damp brush and some little tiny strokes of color here and there will give you a very three-dimensional look. If you get too much of a color, you can do that little bit of a mop-up technique and lift a little bit of the moisture and the paint away. Okay, so just that quickly, you've learned an awful lot about values and how to control how much pigment you have in each of your brush applications. One other little tip that I will show you, since this is still wet, I don't want to get you in trouble of trying this, but if your vase area is dry, before or after you've colored in with the pattern to it, if you have a light value, let's say like a 2 or a 1 value on your brush, you could make a quick stroke of a very light color like this on either side of the vase, and that will give the illusion of a much more rounded shape. I just don't want to have you doing that when the rest of the dark blue is still wet. Next, we're going to paint our poppies and have some fun with letting 2 colors mix together wet on wet. I have over here, I have scarlet. This is pyrrole scarlet. And here I have quinacridone rose, and I've created puddles with each of them that are pretty vivid color, and I'm going to make sure that I've cleaned my brush of other colors. Go into my well water, and I'm going to dip into the pure color here and check that I have a really nice vivid color on my damp brush. Don't want it too wet. And I'm going to do some large wet brush strokes to the right side of each of these flowers. Very random. I haven't tried to color in all the way around the edges. And very quickly, while that is still wet, I'm cleaning my brush just so that I can enjoy the rich color here of this rose. When it's pure color. It's going to be very intense, and my brush feels a little bit dry, so I'm going to get a little bit more color here actually from my puddle, and there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly, and I want it to be very vivid color, I'm coloring in a swash or two next to the scarlet on each flower, and letting the two colors just mix together. If you don't color all the way up to the edges, those little highlights actually look very interesting. So try that, and it's going to dry a little bit lighter than that. And while it's drying, at this point we don't want to do the greens or it's all going to run together, and these are complementary colors, so it would go quite dark. So I'm going to move these out of the way, and we're going to start painting the next one, and then we'll come back to the poppies when the reds, the rose and scarlet have dried. Usually I work on a larger sheet of paper, and but for this video, so that you can see exactly what I'm using, I cut the page down in advance. So that you can see where I'm getting my colors from the palette, and where I'm using my swamp water and my well water. So I had that strong rose color on my brush, and I washed it off, but if I had been anticipating ahead, whichever of those colors, and you could do them in either order, I'm going to use a vivid shade of the scarlet on that blossom, and if you wanted to add some of the rose, you could do that. I'm going to dip into that, but it's rather wet at the moment. But those two colors together give you a beautiful vivid color. So we'll let that dry, and I need to totally clean my brush next, because I'm going to go back to my yellows, and I want that beautiful vivid yellow color. Okay, so now this little puddle, we'll see, I might even dip back into the yellow pocket. And this one is the hardest to keep from being contaminated by the other darker colors. So I would work with it very carefully so that you can always get that nice yellow when you want it. And that having a particular area for the puddle is helpful so that you can keep it true to its beautiful Hansa yellow color. So now I'm doing the largest area of this flower, not too wet, but that should give me a nice vivid yellow colors. And if I proceed with the scarlet or even the gamboge, I'll need to, it will run into the yellows. So I'm going to let the yellow dry, and we'll move on to another area that's not touching. I tend to do a lot of multiple painting at the same time, and then instead of waiting for one thing to dry, you move on to another area and come back again. So next we're going to talk about our blues and how we mix purple. So in these compartments up here, I've placed the quinacridone rose in each of these additional areas, and I've also placed each of the blues. And in this case, I've put the marine to the outside so that I can refer to it as the outside blue, and I've put some of the phthalo blue in this one. And they're not going to be all that different in the application that we do with them, but I have created a puddle here using the mix of those two. So if I run my brush into the rose color at the back and get just a little bit of the blue from the front, I can create a beautiful magenta color purple. And if I go more into the blue, down here I can have a darker purple. So, and I initially didn't start out with all of the purples, but you've got other variations that you can do over on this side as well. So I've cleaned my brush, and I'm going to go back to do a light blue first on these vertical little blossoms. And I'm going to test that I have, oh, let's say a medium shade of that blue. And since the flowers are so small, I'm almost just doing dots of color. And if that seems a little bit too wet, if I touch it and do that mop-up technique, it's going to lift it and give me a lighter blue. And I'm going to let that dry a bit so that when I add some purple, it won't just all run together. So while that's drying, I'm going to move on to another flower. So now with the daisies, we're going to paint the negative space, in this case greens, behind so that the daisies pop forward. So to do that, I probably am best to get puddles going of several different colors and shades of green. And I want to be sure I have some light green, so I'm doing more of the yellow and making sure I have some light green. I have a darker shade of that one. And from this combination of yellow and the outside blue, I'll get more of an olive color. And it's nice to have about that much of a puddle ready in advance so that once you start, you can work wet on wet. So I've forgotten what's on my brush. It's good to check it. Okay, I've got a bit of light green and that'll be fine. So I dip into my lighter green to start with, and I'm making very quick brush strokes all the way around the daisies. I'm not even being that precise with it. But by leaving the daisies white, I'm creating some beautiful greens, like the green field here behind the daisies. I found that if I'm going to paint the background, I prefer to do the background first, and then I'll know kind of where I'm going. So I've created an interesting shape with the light green, and while that's still wet, I'm now dipping into my more of an olive green, and I'm coming back in, and this time I'm going to paint in a smaller area. I'll come in maybe a little bit more carefully around the daisies, and now I'm going to paint around the leaves, which will leave them to be the lighter green color. And again, I'm making nice big strokes, and you can see in my samples that each time I've had a different look to it. It may be lighter, darker green, but they all come out very fun. And right from the beginning, you're learning how to create a beautiful backdrop to your painting. And I'm going to go even darker. So I'll get my brush back into the yellow and dip a little bit more into the blue to get a darker color, because this is going to dry lighter. So maybe this third pass I go to an even smaller area and more central to making the daisies pop here by putting dark color behind. Brings the daisies forward. Okay, so that should work. You can see very loose brush strokes. Each one is different and interesting in a different way. So I wasn't that worried about exactly where I went around the daisies, but it gives it a very nice touch. While that one is drying, I can now come back and add more to each of these and do all my greens at the same time. So checking that the poppies are dry, I'm going to use the olivey green color, and again I'm going to just come in and around all of this area. Great big quick brush strokes. It's a very impressionistic approach, but it's very fun and freeing actually once you try it. Now that area is quite wet, so I might mop up just a little bit of it. But that will create some interesting patterns as it dries. Okay, and then I'm going to get a little bit more of my light green over here on this one. And again, I'm taking the broad stroke approach of covering all of the stems and a little bit there. Maybe I add a little bit more of a darker color up underneath that flower. Okay, and while that's drying, it's safe to go back to this area of the blues. So I checked that my brush is clean, and now I come back to my purpley colors here, test it on my little scrap paper, and without it being too wet, I need a little bit more pigment and a little bit less water. Now I'm simply going to add some other little dots of purple. And if that looks a little bit too contrasty, I might use my brush to lift just a little bit of it and soften and let those colors kind of mix and blend together. Okay, now this area has had a chance to dry, so now it's safe if I want to come back in. This color is gamboge. It's a beautiful, almost a saffron kind of color, and I can now paint in the middle of the flower without losing the yellows around it. And since my color is a bit wet, kind of a puddle there, I'm going to add a little bit more to it. And then if I want to add just a little bit of the scarlet, if I add it to that area while it's wet, it will simply blend together. But I didn't get the yellow area wet, so it's staying and will dry within that center of the flower. And it's, maybe I lift a little bit in the middle and get a little bit of a highlight. Okay, now assuming that this one has had time to dry, I can come back in with some yellow on my brush and paint in the centers. And maybe with a little bit of the gamboge, I might just touch it to the left-hand side of each of the centers. There we go. Over here on the poppies, once it's mostly dry, if I want to come back in with a darker shade on the little seed pods, I can add a little touch there. Maybe I add a little bit darker green at the stem of each of the leaves. Now might be a good time to come back and do the little shadows on your fence. So I'm going to get a darker green on my brush, and I'm simply going to make 5, whoops, that's too wet. I'm going to blot it quickly. Okay, make sure I have some more pigment on my brush and not as wet. Okay, there we go. So I take the point of my brush and pull it out from each of the fence posts. And look at that, sun came out. I just love that detail. Over here, I'm going to show you another last little detail, which you do not want to do unless everything else is dry. Because I'm working in front of these bright lights, it dried much quicker than yours may have, but I want to show you. So I'm going to get a very little bit of a very light blue on my brush, and be sure and test it here to see what you've got. Okay, I want like a 1 or 2 value. And now I'm going to just very lightly and rather dry touch some little strokes of blue around the center of each of the daisies. This will just look like shadowing that just adds a very nice last little detail. Okay, well, I hope you've had fun following along with all of these little vignettes, and you've learned many, many different techniques all in one first 101 lesson here. And next I'm going to show you a couple other things that you can do on your own to keep practicing. I'm going to suggest some homework that you might try during this next week. If you followed along, you may go back and just practice getting that free flood sort of approach to getting a dramatic sky and play with the water line. You may, in some cases, prefer to simply work on the paper and come back and stamp later. It's up to you. In this one, you might stamp, just try stamping before or after with the sailboat images. And you can practice your free flow technique. When your sailboats are dry, then you can have some fun doing different patterns on the sails. Then if you want to practice your hillsides, try creating all different shades of green, and you can try different proportions and maybe just play where you're just letting all the colors mix together with a very wet on wet technique. Maybe you do some very random work first, and afterwards stamp into it where it fits, and maybe you just want to simply add a little horizon line or a wiggly line that would define the tops of the trees a little bit. Then if you want to practice your value studies, why not try it in several other color schemes? It's quite fun to just get the feel of light and dark. You could do all pastels, whatever you like. Try your poppies in different colors. Try your flowers with background bits of green, and do splashy colors like I did on this one, and just have some fun trying different variations. Next, I want to talk about the interesting torn edges. Sometimes I've trimmed them straight, other times I've done a beautiful torn edge, which gives the look of a decal edge. Watercolor paper has this beautiful irregular edge, and if you want to do that with a small painting, it really creates a beautiful look. So let me show you. If you've painted all of your pieces on one large sheet like this, you may have trouble getting in between things enough to do the tearing, but if you have a little bit more of an edge or want to do a first cut to separate them, then if you can get a hold of about at least 1/4 of an inch of the paper, notice how I'm holding it right up close so it doesn't tear the actual painted area, and I'm pulling away to the top like this so that the more irregular edge is on the top side. I just create a rectangular shape one way or another, and each time comes out a little bit different, but just gives it a very fun look. And again, if you've got your straight cuts, you can always cut straight and simple around the edge, but I like the beauty of the decal edge for these little watercolors. as you separate your large sheet, you end up having lots of little leftover pieces. And you can see that I was using these to create little test strips. But you can also have some fun with the puddles that are still in your palette. You might paint a lot of those little scrap pieces and have some fun just mixing and blending different colors together, and putting them onto cards with the messages will make very fun little whimsical cards. So I hope you've had fun with Lesson 101, and next week we will use the same 3 stamp sets, but we will take it into further, more advanced techniques. And I hope you will continue watching, and you can go back and review this one at any time. You can go back and review the earlier countdown videos as well if you want more information about the palette or the brush or different kinds of papers. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.